Hello and a warm welcome. China is proposing to introduce new security laws in Hong Kong. The issue is on the agenda for the National People's Congress session, which will start in Beijing on Friday. The NPC is China's parliament, although it's seen as little more than a rubber stamp for Communist Party decisions. Now, opponents say that the new laws essentially amount to a power grab by China. Beijing, however, says the laws will bring Hong Kong into line with the mainland. Here's a government spokesperson.
National security is the bedrock of the country's stability. Safeguarding national security is the common interest of all people, including Hong Kong compatriots.
Well, Hong Kong's mini-constitution, called the Basic Law, came into effect when British rule ended in 1997 and the territory was handed back to China. And it does require its government to bring in this security law. And Beijing has always had the power to enact the national security law into the Basic Law. But that's not how many in Hong Kong see this move. Just have a listen to this.
This is the end of Hong Kong. This is the end of one country, two systems. Make no mistake about it, that Beijing, the Central People's Government, has completely breached its promise to the Hong Kong people, a promise that was enshrined in the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Basic Law. And they are now completely walking back on their obligation owed to the Hong Kong people.
And there are also fears that these proposed laws are actually aimed at suppressing scenes like these ones. These images show the often violent clashes between authorities and pro-democracy protesters back in 2019 and also a little earlier this year. This was in response to a bill that would have allowed Beijing to extradite people to mainland China to face trial. Well, here's the BBC's Martin Yip in Hong Kong with more.
We might not know any formal details until they actually pass the resolution, but what we can tell from those leaks on local media, multiple media outlets in Hong Kong, include subversion, separatism, terror activities and foreign intervention. It's said to be a decision to be passed by the National People's Congress, so it's more likely to be like a decree from, rather than like a full piece of law with jail time and all that. But these are the four areas that will be covered in this law. And at this moment, you might remember that there used to be a proposed legislation on national security in Hong Kong back in 2003, which ended up with such a backlash and with almost 500,000 people going onto the street in protest. The only point that is new on top of that bill, which was demanded by Beijing, is terrorism.
Well, Gina Ann Tam is a historian who specialises in China. She's been tweeting about this. She said, for those saying that there have been warning signs of Beijing's decision for months, if not years, this is still monumental. The protests were energised by hope and unlikely possibilities. So many of Hong Kong's possible futures and the protests' possible outcomes have now been erased. Well, let's now hear from Martin Lee. He's a veteran politician in Hong Kong, and he actually played a leading role in drafting the law that specified the constitutional rights and freedoms of Hong Kong citizens when the UK handed it back to China in 1997. Here's his reaction to this news.
Well, China is going to break even more promises made to Hong Kong people and to the British government in the Sino-British Joint Declaration by keeping on doing these things. Now, it's not just the law which they intend to pass in Beijing for Hong Kong, which is clearly in breach of the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law, because it is up to the Hong Kong legislature, our legislative council, to enact laws for Hong Kong. The Standing Committee of the NPC cannot do it under our mini-constitution, the Basic Law, but they are going to do it. So quite apart from the draconian law which is going to be passed, it will be passed in Beijing instead of in Hong Kong. Now, I think they are afraid that they may lose control of the Hong Kong Legislative Council at the next election in a few months later in September. So they want to start a precedent so that they can legislate for Hong Kong by bypassing the Hong Kong Legislative Council. So it is a double disaster for Hong Kong.
So strong words there from Martin Lee. Now, we still haven't had any reaction from the United Kingdom to this news. As for other international reaction, here's President Trump.
I don't know what it is because nobody knows yet. If it happens, we'll address that issue very strongly.
Well, Mr. Trump's State Department has since warned China against imposing the new laws, saying that a high degree of autonomy and respect for human rights were key to preserving the territory's special status. Lord Chris Patten was Hong Kong's last governor before the 1997 handover, and he thinks that the UK should be leading an international response to Beijing's announcement.
We should make it clear to the Chinese that this is outrageous. The Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary should make that absolutely clear. We should talk to our allies, our friends around the world, all of whom have a stake in two things. First of all, the continuance of Hong Kong as a great international city in Asia. And secondly, in whether or not China can be trusted to keep its word. Now, there are all too many examples of that not being the case. The way it's actually used, the preoccupation which everybody rightly has with fighting this awful epidemic, they've used that preoccupation in order to bully and harass in other areas, and one of them's in Hong Kong.
Well, we can speak live now to Professor Rana, Mitta, who is the director of the University of Oxford China Centre. Thank you so much for being with us. What's your thinking in the timings of this decision, these negotiations, this debate which will take place on Friday? But why now, do you think?
I think that a couple of things have come together, Kasia. One is that, of course, as various of your speakers were saying, the COVID-19 pandemic has meant that the world's attention is turned away from Hong Kong and away from anything that isn't to do directly with the virus. So it provides a sort of breathing space in terms of China's new policy. But second, it's clear that for months, China has becoming increasingly impatient or actually outraged by the way in which it sees Hong Kong being out of control. And I think for some ways, the problem for them is not so much the violent protests, which caught a lot of the attention last year and were very photogenic, but actually the increased peaceful protest, which was becoming more and more obvious in the streets during the course of last year, and the democratic election at the local council level of candidates who were against the idea of expanding Beijing's power. So it seemed that this was a moment to choose before the situation went even more away from the direction that Beijing would like to take.
We're sensing this sense of shock about this and the anger as well and the fears. But when it comes to it, Beijing has always had the right to enact these security laws into Hong Kong's mini constitution, into its basic laws. So why this outrage?
Well, that's true. And in 2003, quite a while ago, there was an attempt to put it into action, which was then stopped by a demonstration of about 500,000 people in the streets. I think in the end, the most important thing will be not just the implementation of the law, but how it gets used. Hong Kong does still have a much freer press than the rest of China. It still has an independent judiciary with some foreign judges on it. If those institutions now seem to basically come under the control of this wider legislation, then we'll know that the autonomy promised to Hong Kong in 1997, which Chris Patten, who just had, was very much in charge of at that point and oversaw, if that changes, then I think that will suggest that something has really changed in Hong Kong. But it will also mean that China has given up on it being a major international city, because rule of law and free press are two of the things that make Hong Kong distinct and give the international business community confidence that they can keep their investments and their resources there.
So this idea, this one country, two systems that has been operational in Hong Kong, are you effectively saying that this is going to come to an end?
No, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that this is a very, very dangerous moment, because if the law is enacted, and technically speaking, it is true that the Beijing government is entitled to do that, how it is implemented, how those promises of autonomy, freedom and the ability to continue to dissent and to speak much more freely than the rest of China, which is absolutely unique to Hong Kong within Greater China, aside, of course, from Taiwan, which is a territory not ruled by Beijing. If that changes, then it will make the rest of the world extremely nervous about the way in which China as a whole is going. Keeping Hong Kong's situation as it is one token that China has given the world that it does stick to international treaties. Looking at how they handle this will be seen as a very important precedent for what happens next in the world's dealing with China.
So in that case, when we're talking about how the rest of the world should react, what can they effectively do if, as you're suggesting, China is willing to let Hong Kong go as a major trading territory?
Well, it's not clear that that is the case yet. I mean, for instance, it's very much the case that China's major tech industry, lots of which is just across the border in the city of Shenzhen, really relies on Hong Kong as a pool of capital to bring about investment. Now, anything that scared off those investors, or indeed the fear of Hong Kong business people that they could be easily extradited to the mainland if the laws are loosened, these things will damage business confidence if they come about. And so it will be very incumbent on Beijing to say, we're implementing the law because we want to get this done as we're allowed to do, but we want to demonstrate, bend over backwards almost, to show that nothing else has changed in Hong Kong. Now, that's a big challenge, but that's exactly what the rest of the world will be looking for, and also, I'm sure, calling out if they see any backsliding in terms of those conditions allowing free business, free media, free speech.
Professor Mitta, absolutely fascinating to get your insight. Thank you so much.